honor for me to be with colleagues and friends in Kerala, and I'm very grateful to the Kerala Higher Secondary Teachers Union and Ms. Archaleri for giving me this opportunity. ആദ്യം തന്നെ ഞാൻ നിങ്ങളോട് മാപ്പ് ചോദിക്കട്ടെ. ഞാൻ കേരളത്തിൽ ജനിച്ചതും പഠിച്ചതും ഒന്നുമല്ല. അത് കാരണം ഇത്തരം വിഷയത്തിൽ മലയാളത്തിൽ സംസാരിക്കാൻ എനിക്ക് കഴിവില്ല. ഹിന്ദിയിൽ എനിക്ക് പറ്റുമായിരുന്നു, പക്ഷെ മലയാളത്തിൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് കാണാം എൻ്റെ വളരെ മോശമാണ് എൻ്റെ മലയാളം. അത് കാരണം എനിക്ക് നല്ലപോലെ വായിക്കാൻ മനസ്സിലാവും, പക്ഷെ സംസാരിക്കാൻ പറ്റില്ല. എന്നാലും എൻ്റെ അപ്പോളജി അക്സെപ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യൂ. എന്നിട്ട് ഞാൻ ഇനി ബാക്കിയുള്ള സ്പീച്ച് ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ തന്നെ ചെയ്യാൻ പോണു. So when we talk, many of the issues have already been raised by previous speakers. So let's begin with, what do we mean when we say National Education Policy 2020? What is the document that we are talking about? Because there are multiple documents that are circulating. This is actually something we should take very seriously, because this is one of the what we call the National Education Policy is a document that is on the MHRD website. But there are multiple documents that are circulating, and there is no clarity as to which exactly is, in fact, the NEP. So there are at least 4 documents. So I'm saying that this is characteristic of this government, that it subverts all procedures and functions with utter lack of transparency and duplicity, because it has had multiple drafts ready and produces each one as it suits them. So, for example, when Hindi imposition was objected to, they suddenly produced a draft where Hindi was not imposed. So there are multiple drafts. So there are at least 4 documents which we should take seriously, and we shouldn't assume that the 66-page document that we see on the MHRD website with no signatures and no names of committee members. If you look at this 66-page supposedly final National Education Policy document, there are no names and there are no signatures on it. That is one document. But prior to this, there was so this is 66 pages, but there was a close to 500-page document called the Draft National Education Policy 2019, which many of us commented on. That was the draft on which suggestions were sought, and a number of unions and educationists responded. And that was subsequently pruned down into a 56-page abbreviated version by the MHRD, which was called the National Education Policy 2019. And 2 days before the NEP 2020, which is now on the website, was uploaded, 2 days before that, there was yet another document that was circulated by the MHRD, which was called NEP 2020 Final for Circulation. So we are talking about 4 different versions of the NEP. And this supposedly final 66-page document, which is what we will focus on, we should remember, we have no idea how many of the institutions and policies articulated in the longer documents, how many of those are actually still functioning. We don't know. How much of them have they been rejected? Are they still functional? Professor Krishna Kumar has also talked about a 200-page policy document, which is not been made. Okay. So now, when we go to the NEP as such, so first of all, the procedures are problematic, and it is murky. And as everyone has pointed out, it was passed without a discussion in Parliament. But so we don't know how many of the really problematic issues in the draft 2019 will find its way back. We don't know. But we will, for now, consider only the NEP 2020, the 66-page document that is uploaded on the website. And I want to say that I am drawing on inputs from a large number of educationists who have written about this, from my own union, that is the JNU Teachers Association. We also did an analysis of the draft. So I am drawing actually on a large number of inputs. This is not my singular contribution. And I'm sharing these with you because we're all part of the teachers movement which has to oppose this. There is not one single thing in this document that we can accept. We should not be seduced by the language. The language of it uses multidisciplinarity, and it sometimes says diversity and all of this. But as I hope to show you, there is actually in practice not a single policy of this should be acceptable to us. So the two key elements of this policy have already been addressed by by our previous speakers. But let me go into it in a little bit of detail. So the first is the clear thrust towards privatization, both at school level and at the higher education level. Now, let us also recognize that this move had already begun under the term of the UPA, the second term, UPA 2. This had already begun. And it was at that time, if you remember, that the Ambani-Birla report on education was produced, the policy framework for reforms in education. And that document advocated foreign direct investment in education and initiated the idea of the private universities bill and so on. It was violently opposed by academics and teachers' movements. But what is interesting is that that document is reflected, that is the Birla-Ambani document, is very strongly reflected in the new NEP 2020. So this is something we have to recognize. Now, many of the recommendations of that document find their place in this document. Now, the term that they use, the NEP 2020 uses for privatization, is philanthropy. The term philanthropy and philanthropic occurs 17 times in the 16-page document, and they never use the word private without putting philanthropic before it. It's a bit of a challenge to, we could play it like a puzzle or like a game, to look at this document and see if the word private occurs just like that, without any qualifying beautiful adjective, like philanthropic, generous, this kind of thing. So PPP in this document is not public-private partnership, but public-philanthropic partnership. So philanthropic also acts as a simile for private. When they say philanthropic, they mean private. So, for example, there are 2 points that are made one after the other. One, that I'm quoting the document, education is a public service. It's a public service. Access to quality education must be considered the basic right of every child. Very nice. There's nothing wrong with this. The next statement, substantial investment in a strong, vibrant public education system, as well as the encouragement and facilitation of true philanthropic, private and community participation. So if education is a public good, and there is actually a strong and vibrant public, which means state-funded education system, what exactly is the role they're envisaging for philanthropic, private and community participation? So obviously the intention is to encourage and facilitate. In fact, they use these terms, encourage, and they're going to encourage and facilitate philanthropic and community participation. So lip service is paid to a vibrant public education system, but the actual encouragement and facilitation is of philanthropic, that is private capital, and community, which is basically people, Atmanirbhar. You know this term by now, right? That we have to just basically do our work ourselves. Now, as far as school, there's a specific change as far as higher education is concerned, and this is something that I want to draw to your attention, which you're probably already aware of. But there is a higher education financing agency that has been already set up. That is not mentioned anywhere in either the draft bill or any of those 4 versions. Do not even mention the higher education financing agency, HEFA, which was set up in 2017. It's up and running. You can go to their website and see. JNU has already taken a loan from HEFA. What is HEFA's job? HEFA's job is to give, it's a government, it's not a private organization. It's a government, it's set up by the government. And its job is to give loans for infrastructural development to higher education institutions. What does this mean? That financing for infrastructure in higher education institutions will no longer be given as grants by the government, but the higher education institutions have to take loans from the government, which they have to repay by raising their own resources. Higher education institutions raising their own resources basically means a flat increase of fees, high increase of fees, because these loans have to be repaid. So you can see that privatization is happening in these different ways, and many things are being hidden from us. Now, because why doesn't the NEP mention HEFA? It should mention HEFA. It doesn't mention HEFA. Now, what is interesting is that when you go to the HEFA website, it tells us that they're very proud, and it's doing so well and all of that. Its scope is expanding to include school education and educational institutes under Ministry of Health, etc. ETC. This is actually from the site. So obviously, ETC suggests, etc., suggests that it could be anything. The expansion could be enormous, and we have no way of saying to what extent. So far, HEFA is for higher education institutions, but it has every intention of expanding to schools, to medical colleges under the government, which means that we will all our institutions will have to be raising our own money for infrastructural development. So this is the first element, privatization. I'm very briefly going to talk about only some of the key issues. And the second element, which we've already we know because we are living under a regime that has declared Hindu Rashtra. Let's face it, India is living under Hindu Rashtra. Now, so the second key element is what we call saffronization. But I think that's a very mild word, and I think we should call it what it is, which is the Hindu supremacist ideology. It's like racism, it's like white supremacism, it's a Hindu supremacist ideology, and it's exceedingly Brahminical. So it's in a sense, a Brahminical Hindu supremacist ideology. And you can see that agenda also very clearly in this document, masked in very innocuous terms, which we recognize as code words. That is, we have now lived long enough in this country under the onslaught of this kind of politics to know what are the code words for Hindu supremacism. So, for example, there are references to quote-unquote rich, diverse Indian tradition, quote-unquote eternal Indian knowledge. So there are many times these kinds of terms are used. So first of all, I think for a 21st century document to talk about any eternal knowledge is deeply problematic. It shows you have absolutely no conception of what knowledge is. There is no such thing as an eternal knowledge. But so they say rich and they say diverse and then they say eternal and then they spell it out. They give some examples. So they claim that the pursuit of, that something that they call Indian thought and philosophy has always considered as its highest human goal, the pursuit of jnanam, prajna and satyam. Okay? Or as they put it, because this is a very North Indian way of writing Sanskrit, they talk a lot about Sanskrit. 90% of them don't have any idea about Sanskrit. So the pursuit of jnana, pragya and truth was always supposedly considered to be in Indian thought and philosophy as the highest human goal. But we know very well that the pursuit of knowledge and truth was limited to a very small class and group of men. Dalits were excluded, women were excluded, etc. We know this. But of course, this suggests there was some brilliant country in which everybody could pursue. So this is Indian. So they claim that the eternal Indian knowledge is this, that this has been there for all times. And then they list a number of scholars' names. And they use this phrase, great scholars produced by the Indian education system. And these names begin from Charaka, Shruta, goes on to Aryabhatta, Madhava, etc. Tiruvalluvar, it ends with Tiruvalluvar. So these are scholars which pretty much ends, that means in the 3rd, 4th century AD, or as we would call it today, Common Era. So the names stop there. These are the scholars who were produced by something that they're calling an Indian education system. This means that they are under the impression, or they want us to believe, that there was something called India that has existed since time immemorial, and that there was something like an Indian education system which produced all these scholars. And what is interesting, I found, I'll come to the second interesting, but the first interesting thing is Gautama is included as one of the scholars. So there's this whole list of names, as I told you, and Gautama is included there. And the RSS twin agenda is clearly visible here. One, assimilating all non-Islamic religions into Hinduism. So Gautama is no longer divine in this understanding. Only Hindu deities are divine. Gautama is a scholar. He has been given respect as a scholar. So this is the kind of assimilation of non-Islamic religions into Hinduism, and of course, the complete exclusion of Islamic and non-Sanskritic traditions as Indian. So it's like all knowledge stopped in 4th century AD, and now this document is going to reproduce and start with something that they're calling Indian language. And of course, it is as if in the centuries that passed, there have been no scholars who have been scholars who have been from Islamic and Arabic traditions and so on. So what we actually see, this national education policy of the 21st century is taking an outdated, a historical, almost mythical view of India, which is shocking. But even more shocking is that for all the lip service to India's supposed eternal knowledge traditions, the actual policy hands over the country's education into private capital and foreign hands. So I wonder, what is their commitment to eternal Indian knowledge? When the foreign universities enter India, are they going to teach eternal Indian knowledge? What do they mean by this? Now, the other interesting thing, which is also part of, I think, Hindu supremacism and the assimilationist policy that RSS adopts, and I talked about the code words for Hindu supremacism. The document mentions fundamental duties. It mentions constitutional values. It does not ever mention rights, fundamental rights. It does not mention fundamental rights ever. Now, constitutional values are mentioned several times, and at one point they're listed. It's worth seeing what they are saying are constitutional values. I won't read all of them. There are like 20 of them, but let me read them out, some of them out. Seva, constitutional values like seva, ahimsa, swachhata, that's a constitutional value. Satya, nishkam karma is a constitutional value. We should be able to work without expecting any reward for it. So these are all actually principles of the Brahminical order, which they are presenting as constitutional values. Shanti, sacrifice. Sacrifice is a constitutional value. So I won't go on. It goes on like this. And of course, then they include gender sensitivity because they claim that, ancient Hinduism was very gender inclusive. Respect for elders is a constitutional value. And then patience, forgiveness, empathy, etc. And then finally, after a list of about 30 such so-called values, which are straight out of an RSS primer, they basically, and the last three values that they talk about are justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. But that comes at the end of a long list of mythical values, which are basically RSS values. So we can see that the main thrust of this document is towards privatization and enabling Hindu supremacism. Now, I will look at some of the key elements of school education, and if there's time, then I will go into a little bit on higher education as well. So school education, very quickly, the points. One, the RTE Act is not mentioned at all. It's mentioned in passing as having achieved something earlier, but it is not treated as an existing legislation to which this document has any responsibility. So we don't know how they intend to implement the RTE Act. Is it being considered as an ongoing legislation? RTE Act the right to education does not find a place in this document, except as something that was there in the past. Then we have another feature, which as school, especially as a teachers union, school teachers union, you must have noticed, the practice had already begun of merging schools with lower enrollments into clusters. This had already begun. And by 2018, something like 40,000 schools in Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, and Orissa had been merged. It's called consolidation of resources. Now, what this essentially means is that schools in remote areas are being shut down. If there are 3 or 4 students, that school is being shut down, and those school students now have to travel to the place which is designated as the cluster for that. So you're basically ensuring that people in remote areas, children in remote areas, will not have access to schools. Or they have access to another kind of school. I'll just come to that. So government schools will no longer, they're being clustered like this. And NEP 2020 legitimizes this practice of school mergers by recommending the rationalization of small schools, which are considered economically suboptimal. Now remember, this is a document that is talking about eternal knowledge. It's saying that it is going to allot 6% of the GDP to education. And yet it is judging the viability of school by its economic viability. This is not how a school, because education, as we all would agree, should be free, and it is the state's responsibility to run a school. It's not the the state's responsibility to see if a school is economically viable. So it's they reveal themselves in these ways. They say that, so economically suboptimal, it's an even more horrible term. And they're operationally complex to run. So then, if they are economically suboptimal and operationally complex to run, they will be merged with other schools. This essentially means, as I said, shutting down schools in disadvantaged areas. Thirdly, in their place, so this is what then students can do if they don't want to travel miles and miles to some cluster. The policy regularizes low fee paying schools with poor infrastructure and untrained teachers, and legitimizes one teacher schools. So these can be private, and these can be run anywhere. They're low fee paying, and there's absolutely no control over them. So private, unregulated, and with absolutely no schools with absolutely no standards can be set up to deal with these remote areas. This new flexible structure is so-called is essentially, and this point has been made, it's essentially encouraging young children to drop out earlier without considering why students drop out and what are the socioeconomic reasons for which they drop out. So that is an issue. Another issue is that, interestingly again, the constitutional categories of SC, ST and OBC are not mentioned. They're not mentioned. Instead, this document repeatedly uses a term that we have never seen in any Government of India document before: socio-economically disadvantaged groups. What is this category? This is a category that this document simply produces. We have never heard it before. How is it to be defined? And if you're simply going to say that it's socioeconomically disadvantaged groups, it's such a large umbrella term, it could mean more than 50% of the population. And it also means, of course, that there is no reference to reservations. So constitutional terms are continuously being not only bypassed, but as we saw with the term constitutional values, there is a clear attempt to subvert what is being. This is the RSS constitution that they were talking about, not our constitution. Then there is a suggestion for special education zones for socio-economically disadvantaged groups. This is apartheid. This is exactly what apartheid is, which is that there will be a segregated school system for 80% of the population. So 80% of the population will have access to shabby, shoddy infrastructure. There will be no control over any of them. 20%, and they even use the term informal education measures. So in these special economic zones, there will be informal education measures, whereas their children will study in the 20%, will be studying in foreign universities which are set up here. So they will study in Oxford and Cambridge University without actually having to pay Oxford and Cambridge University fees. They'll sit here in India. They'll have access to all this. And socio-economically disadvantaged groups will be given something called informal education in the special education zones. And the vocational education will start from class 6. Now, earlier policies had delayed the introduction of vocational learning because, including the Kothari Commission and other documents, because they wanted young children from all social strata to have some years of exposure to all-round academic exposure. But this is very clearly saying drop out at class 6 if you do not have the capacity to understand what we're teaching you, right? So this is very clear that there is a very strong. Next we come to a very quick thing on language policy, and here I'm drawing largely on the critique made by Ganesh Devi, who, as you know, runs the Bhasha Institute, and he has actually done some extraordinary work on the languages of India. And he has a very thorough critique of the language policy as outlined in this document. That was one aspect of it was mentioned earlier here in by our by our panelists, co-panelists. But what Ganesh Devi is saying about the three-language formula as it appears in this document is that in a Hindi-speaking region, the child will have Hindi for the first language, and for the second language, again, it can be Hindi, which may be with a higher complexity, or maybe Sanskrit, all right? And the third will be English. So Hindi, and maybe higher level of Hindi, and then English. But he's saying, look at states like Kerala or Telangana or Tamil Nadu. They will have a language of their own, and Hindi and English. So the cognitive load, as he puts it, is higher when you move away from the Hindi belt. So this three-language formula is actually a disguise again for normalizing Hindi as a language, as the state language. So now it's not Hindi imposition, but basically a disadvantage is inbuilt for students from who are further away from the Hindi belt, because they have to study more languages than those who are in the Hindi belt, whose mother tongue is Hindi. So the People's Linguistic Survey of India is the famous work that Ganesh Devi has done. The second question that Ganesh Devi asks is, what if the mother tongue of one of the children is a scheduled tribe language, or Tulu in Karnataka? That is not the main language of the state, but a scheduled tribal language, or Tulu, or Kutchi in Gujarat, or Irani in Maharashtra. What if the mother tongue is a language that is not the main language of that state? Now they will have to learn their mother tongue up to class 5, then the state's language, then Hindi, then English. And so what he's saying is, the further we go away from the center, the higher is the learning load. And the more marginalized groups have actually a higher learning load. And these are precisely the children who become dropouts because their mother tongues have been different. So the three-language formula, the three-language policy, the way this NEP outlines it, is deeply problematic. There's been no attempt to think about this because they're not interested. It's all been done in such haste. This is something that could have been included, which could have been developed in very important ways. And none of us, as was said earlier, none of us has a problem with learning the mother tongue. All of us have one language, learn our mother tongue. But the way this is structured, it will actually disadvantage the groups that are further away from the Hindi belt and the groups that are marginalized. The second point he makes is actually very important about English and Sanskrit. So the census of 2011 shows the number of English speakers as relatively small. And this is interesting because when people record English as their second language, it is not counted. But look at the data for Sanskrit in the 2011 census, the number of speakers of Sanskrit will have grown. So the number of speakers recorded as English speakers has come down in the census of 2011. But if you look at Sanskrit, apparently speakers of Sanskrit has gone up in 2011 because when Sanskrit is mentioned as the second language, it is counted. Now, what is interesting here, and Ganesh Devi doesn't specify it, but that means that there is a strong RSS campaign going on to record Sanskrit as the second language in the census. Because I can be pretty sure that there are very, very few people for whom Sanskrit is actually the second language. So this has been an RSS campaign, obviously. And so, interestingly, it looks as if the number of Sanskrit speakers in India is rising and the number of English speakers in India is falling. And Ganesh Devi points out that since Sanskrit is no longer a living language, the way Sanskrit is taught is simply through grammar. We all have studied Sanskrit like that. So what happens is it fetches good scores. So children can score higher in Sanskrit than in Hindi or Bengali or Odia. And this will prepare the ground, he's saying, for claiming that there are millions of Sanskrit speakers and go towards a recreation of a Sanskrit-based reconstructed past. So this English-Sanskrit dichotomy is also interesting because the attempt is to falsely produce Sanskrit as a language that is actually used by large numbers of Indians. Can I take another maybe 5 minutes?
Yes, ma'am. 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Thank you. So the final part of my presentation is on higher education. I'll just briefly go into that. So the NEP 2020 states that a few universities will be research universities And some will be teaching universities. The research universities will be a mix of state-run and private. And the same thing is going to happen in higher education that they want to do in schools, which is they're going to shut down colleges and merge colleges so that there are enormous colleges. Like there cannot be an institution which has less than 15,000 students. This is going to be the way they function. All right. So, and we know what this means, research universities, etc. So we know that, for example, Geo University was given a Center of Excellence badge before it even came into being. So we are going to see a lot of this happening. Each institute of this kind of private institute can make its own rules. They can decide minimum policies, etc. Now, in order to reduce the number of colleges to 15,000, there will be like closures and mergers, like corporate style closures and mergers. And then who will choose which college? How do students choose which college? And which is the college that will be treated as the 15,000 student body college, and which are the colleges that will have to merge with that college? What does this mean for faculty? What does this mean for existing faculty and jobs? What does it mean for future jobs? It's not a good picture. There's going to be a National Research Association which will decide research topics. So higher education and critical thinking, forget about it. And each of the autonomous 15,000 plus member colleges will have a board of governors which the college will appoint. The board of governors will have complete control, and there is absolutely no scope for democratic representation at decision-making level. Terms like CEO are used. JNU has already advertised for a CEO for one of the new schools that they have set up. So there will be people who are set up to run these things like corporations, because obviously economic viability and economic optimal functioning is the key requirement. And so there will be absolutely no way in which universities will have any democratic input. So finally, I just want to summarize that overall one could say that the NEP 2020, I could say, let's say 4 points about the NEP 20, that education is now very clearly a commodity which has to be economically viable in the capitalist market. Number 2, there is a very clear Hindu supremacist agenda, which we have to stop saying saffronization for it. Like we stopped saying eve teasing and we call it what it is, which is sexual harassment, because eve teasing made it sound so mild. Saffronization actually sounds very mild. Let us recognize this for what it is. It is a Hindu supremacist agenda. Thirdly, it is, and as I said, it's Brahminical. Thirdly, very clearly elitist, widening and institutionalizing. That is, the state is institutionalizing the divide between a small minority with access to foreign universities in India and the rest having to drop out to by class 6 to do vocational work. So that is, of course, the logic of Make in India, because Make in India basically means come here because we can offer you cheap labor. It's telling foreign capital to come to India for cheap labor. So that's the logic which is behind saying you can drop out at class 6 and do vocational training. And finally, it's very obvious, and that's the fourth aspect of NEP 2020, critical thinking is going to be literally banned. So forget dissent. There will be no space for critical thinking. And I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, madam. Thank you very much on behalf of Kerala Higher Secondary Teachers